Today we take a look at chapter 14, section 1, which is a continuation of Middle Age Europe or the medieval times. Today we're going to kind of chop up the Middle Ages from 500 to 1500. We're going to talk about different ages within the Middle Ages, and the first one is the Age of Faith from 800 to 1500. Prior to that period, though, there was something called the Dark Ages, which we've been talking about a little bit. I wanted to sort of reference that. Why is it really called the Dark Age? Well, there's a couple of reasons why historians generally refer to this time period as the Dark Age. Number one is the massive amount of invasions that were coming from the Vikings, from the Magyars from the east, from the Muslims from the south. And those type of things did disrupt trade, but also led to a decline in education. During this time, though, what kind of got us out of the Dark Ages was a revival led by the church. It was really led by monasteries such as Cluny, France. Cluny, France was one of the first to really utilize education as a platform for the monastery. The monks and then nuns that were in the surrounding convents would definitely focus on educating the population in the nearby regions. And that sort of ideology started to click and started to spread. Capital C is going to talk about some of the problems that the church was facing during this time. One of the issues was that many priests during this time frame were illiterate. They couldn't read the Bible, and so it made it quite difficult to preach about the Bible passages. Some popes were questioned on moral issues. Bishops and abbots were sometimes corrupt, and then there were three really big issues in the church that they faced. Many priests actually were married and had families, which was going against church rules. Part of this had to do with the second problem, which was simony. This is bishops that were actually selling positions in the church. So if you wanted to be a priest, you could pay your way in. But also something called lay investiture. This is where, because we have bishops selling positions in the church, you have basically lay people being appointed by kings instead of by the bishops. And so you had less qualified individuals getting into the positions of priests, bishops, so on and so forth, which led to a lot of the problems. The church really wasn't propagating that at all. It's mostly the fact that kings were trying to get friends of theirs, people who were friendly to their ideologies, into positions in the church so that they could propagate their ideologies. That's really one of the things that you have to take a look at there. So the church had to reform and organize against these movements. Two very powerful popes, Pope Leo IX and Gregory VII, began to really enforce church laws against simony and priests being married. From 1100 to 1200, the church was restructured to resemble a kingdom with really the following organization. At the top of the church structure was the Pope. Below the Pope was something called the Papal Curia. These are the Pope's advisors. They acted sort of as a court, like a court would act and advise a king. They developed what's known as canon law, church law that we generally follow in the Catholic Church. Then we had diplomats within the church. Diplomats were sent out to check up on bishops and kings for the Pope throughout Europe, and their job was to make sure that everything was running accordingly. And to fund all of these changes and movements, of course, the church was collecting tithes, the church tax, which was believed to be 10% of your overall income or 10% of your overall crop, was supposed to be donated to the church on Sundays. Today, we put money in the basket as a parish member at the church, and so that's sort of something that has lasted. Capital letter E, some new religious orders for spreading the faith popped up. You had friars. These are groups of priests who would travel from place to place throughout Europe to spread Christianity. They generally took vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, and they definitely lived by begging. They would go around and ask for food and help. The Dominicans were also an early group of friars. They were founded by Dominic, a priest from Spain. And then they had the Franciscans, which were another group of friars founded by Francis of Assisi. Women also participated in friars, in the groups of orders. There was one Franciscan order called the Poor Clares, which was founded by a woman named Clare in 1212. And then we had a female named Hildegard of Bingen, Germany. She founded a Benedictine convent in 1147. Okay. The difference between male and female friars was that males were allowed to travel and go on missions, whereas females were not. Roman numeral number 2. During this time, as the church starts to build, we have cathedrals being constructed. Cathedrals were known as cities of God, very large churches. The first early style was Romanesque. Romanesque was a style of architecture that included round arches and heavy roofs held up by thick walls and pillars, kind of used between 800 and 1100. It's very symbolic of the old school Roman architecture. The new architecture of the time was called Gothic. Gothic came around in the 1100s. It was designed in a very vertical nature to resemble reaching up toward God. It included many sculptures on the inside, wood carvings, stained glass windows. Now, what we have here, where does this name come from? It's a tough question. It comes from the idea that during this time, the old Gothic peoples had controlled Rome, and some of these workings, as they started to convert to Christianity, they began to design some of these structures, and so that's where it took its name. Some of the most famous cathedrals: Paris, France, we have the Cathedral of Notre Dame. We have cathedrals at the cities of Chartres, Reims, Amiens, and Benvois. Between 1170 and 1270, there were over 500 cathedrals built throughout Europe. So this is something that was dominating what was going on in architecture. Here's an example of what Gothic architecture generally looks like. Here's the cathedral at Chartres right there. We have stained glass as an example of stained glass, but you can see the very vertical, vaulted nature on the inside, pointed arches, okay, very tall spires going up and down the sides. So this is an example of Gothic architecture. This is found in your textbook on page 381, by the way. Okay, we'll move on down. We're going to talk about the Crusades next. Okay, the Crusades come into play also during this time. The Crusades are holy wars. They are originally led by the Pope at the time, Pope Urban II. I want to talk about what the goals of the Christian Crusades were and why they were happening. The idea was that the Christians wanted to reclaim Palestine and move the Muslims out of the Holy Land. They wanted to end Muslim attacks on the Byzantine Empire, which were happening frequently. Kings and the church also wanted to get rid of knights who were fighting against each other. We've learned about this during the feudal ages. We had lords and nobles fighting against each other, also trying to sometimes fight against their own king. The Crusades would fix this by making the Muslims the common enemy. That was really one of the motivating factors here. Also, I think what's got to be included here, it's not in the textbook, but the church would offer motivation for people to go on crusades as part of forgiveness for sins. It was a possibility that if you went on the crusade, it was seen as something very holy to do. Capital C talks about the first and second crusades. These crusades included knights and common folks. Their armor and outfit is depicted here on page 382. This is generally what they look like: a little chainmail, little tunic with the red cross on the front, of course, helmets, swords, okay, body armor on the legs as well, kind of like knights that we learned about in chapter 13. Most crusaders were from France, but other groups included crusaders from Germany, England, Scotland, Italy, and also Spain. In the first crusade, it was pretty successful, actually. The crusaders actually captured Jerusalem in 1099. They then divided the territory into 4 states ruled by European leaders. In 1144, though, parts of the territory were reconquered by the Muslim Turks. And so therefore, the Second Crusade was organized to recapture that territory. But the Second Crusade was defeated by a strong Muslim leader named Saladin, a Kurdish warrior who became a very prominent military leader in the Crusade periods. Next, we have capital D, the Third Crusade, which was led by 3 powerful European kings. You had Philip II of France, Frederick I of Germany, and Richard the Lionhearted of England. Who was Richard's mother? The famous Eleanor of Aquitaine that we learned about, being one of the most well sought after females of the Middle Ages. Philip really, from France, he didn't get along with Richard. He left and went home. He left some of his army, he took some of his army back. France and England have a very long history of not getting along. Frederick actually died. He drowned by trying to cross over a river on their way. He thought that he was invincible. A lot of these kings back then, guys, they thought they could do what they want. You got to understand that when you get in these rivers, sometimes there's currents. He was trying to cross the river on his horseback, and they got swept into a current, and his armor was so heavy that he couldn't recover, and he drowned. This left Richard the Lionhearted with the sole responsibility to lead the crusade versus Saladin. And after a series of battles, the 2 leaders agreed to a truce in 1192. The agreement was basically that the Muslims would retain control of the Holy Land, but that Christians could come and worship freely as long as they didn't bring weapons. It was sort of a peaceful agreement but the Muslims would hold on to control of the Holy Land. I think that's a win for the Islamic folks. That they're holding on to the territory. So that's definitely a win there, but at least Christians could come and worship freely without being persecuted. Roman numeral number 4 talks about how the crusading spirit eventually dwindles in the fourth and subsequent crusade attempts. Not much really happened in those. They really were very unsuccessful overall. The Spanish Crusade was one that happened within Spain. In Spain, the Muslims called the Moors controlled most of the country until the 1100s. There was an effort called the Reconquista. This was an effort by the Spanish to drive the Muslims out of Spain. The Muslims were therefore left in possession of a region called Granada until 1492, when the famous Ferdinand and Isabella drove them out. Also, 1492, we know that they commissioned Christopher Columbus to sail to what they thought was India, but he ended up making it to the Americas. Number 4, there's something called the Spanish Inquisition. This is a court of judgment placed on heretics. Heretics were people whose religious beliefs differed from the teachings of the church. Therefore, many Jews and Muslims converted to Christianity in Spain during the 1400s. A person suspected of heresy would be questioned, tortured, and if convicted or confessed, they would be burned at the stake. And basically being burned at the stake is they tie you up to a piece of wood and they have hay around you. They light it on fire and you're burned to death. So the church was doing that. In 1492, Spain expelled all practicing Jews and Muslims as well. So this is the driving out factor, the Reconquista. Roman numeral 4 will talk about some of the effects of the Crusades. For women, those who stayed home during the Crusades ran the estates and operated shops and inns, so they got experience with leadership, whereas if men were there, they probably wouldn't have, so it was a nice opportunity there. Many women, though, did join the Crusades. They went along with their husbands or brothers or sons, and they tried to assist them, not really on the battlefield, but by making food and taking care of the wounded, so on and so forth. Capital letter B talks about trade. Trade actually expanded during the Crusades because you had people from Europe and Southwest Asia mixing and blending. Different type of goods were now going to come to Europe as they were discovered. Spices, fruits, cloth, so on and so forth. Let's talk about popes, nobles, and kings. The failures of the later Crusades actually weakened the power of the pope and also weakened the power of nobles, but actually kings grew a little bit of independent power. Thousands of knights and commoners lost their lives. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks weakened the Byzantine Empire until it eventually fell. And then capital D will talk about the Muslims. The Christians exhibited prejudice toward the Muslims with bitterness and hatred, and vice versa, that I think in some ways still exists to this day. So there's a lot of connecting ideologies there with the past and, of course, the present. Let's take a look at a couple of pictures. Here's a map here's a Crusader again. Here's a map of the Crusades right here. Talks about where did people come from, mostly France, but some Germany. The Holy Roman Empire was where Germany is today. That's what it was called. Italy, you can see that they came down here through Constantinople, and they're trying to get down here into this region here. This is where the goal of the Crusades was. Here's a different path by purple, green, red, and yellow talk about the different Crusades. First, second, third, and fourth, and then the time frame in which they took place. Here's a nice insert box about Richard the Lionhearted and Saladin, sometimes known as Saladin, okay? But you can see that they lived around the same time frame, okay? And it's got a nice little excerpt about what they had done during their time. There is a story here that the book talks about, the Children's Crusade. This took place in the year 1212. Thousands of children set out to conquer Jerusalem. I don't know what their parents were allowing, but they were led by a 12-year-old, Stephen of Cloes. An estimated 30,000 children under 18 joined this crusade. They were armed with only the belief that God would give them the city of Jerusalem. On their march, many died from either cold or starvation. The rest were sold into slavery or drowned at sea. So a terrible event in history. I don't know how this was allowed to happen, but historical documents say that it did. Okay, fellas, that's a little bit about the Crusades and the power of the church during this time span and what was going on with the Dark Ages as well. Thank you.